Okay, hi there everybody. Welcome back for this week's seminar, the webinar. We're really pleased to have you all here today. For everyone that's joined us, it's sunny outside, no snow here. I'm not sure about where you are. I'm Dr. Sarah Powell, Part 1 Director and Director of Outreach here at Lancaster Medical School's Sport and Exercise Science degree. I find myself still sat at home in my office, but I'm going to pretend I'm in our human performance laboratory, and I hope you're all safe and well wherever you're joining us from. So this is the third of our webinars in the Sport and Exercise Science seminar series for 2021. Last week's webinar, 2 weeks ago, the webinar by Dr. Michelle Swainson on how can a sport and exercise scientist improve the nation's health, and our first one by Tim Barry on the role of sport and exercise science in professional football have been uploaded onto the Lancaster University Schools Resources Hub for you to view, and I'll publish a link in the Q&A for anybody who wants access to those. As a team, we hope these webinars will help motivate you to continue to achieve in your studies, but maybe also open your mind a little bit to the potential of a sport and exercise science degree and how many different avenues it can have for your future. But today, I would like to introduce Dr. Chris Gaffney to you all, who will be presenting why would a sport and exercise scientist work for NASA? Now, Chris is a lecturer in integrative physiology and our director of admissions for our degree programme. He was also part of the first UK-led experiment on board the International Space Station, and in contrast, also leads projects investigating exercise before cancer surgery and exercise to improve the quality of life in type 2 diabetic patients, so quite diverse interests. Please feel free to ask questions throughout. I will answer them where I can immediately in the Q&A, but I'll also save some for the end to pose to Chris. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Dr. Chris Gaffney. Enjoy, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Sarah. So, as Sarah's explained, my talk today is going to be around why a sport and exercise scientist would work for NASA. So just to start off, I'm going to give you a bit of a history of spaceflight and try and give this impression of where sports science comes into this and how sport and exercise scientists can try and help with some of the problems that we have with spaceflight. So we look back to the early 60s, so starting off in 1961, we have the first man in space. So we've got the picture there of Yuri Gagarin from the Russian Space Agency. Through the late 60s and the early 70s, you had the Apollo missions. Of course, this is where man first went to the moon. And these were really exciting times for physiologists and medics, because we're starting to see some of the effects of spaceflight on the human body. So the Apollo missions were between 6 and 12 days in space. And one of the main observations that was seen was this reduced ability to exercise. Now, when the Apollo missions were cancelled in the early 70s, some of the Apollo rockets were repurposed, and they had these investigations as part of the Skylab missions that took place in 73 and 74. And this was a real opportunity to try and find out the reasons why we had this reduced exercise ability within space. And the main observations that they had was you got this loss of muscle size and function. This was in our skeletal muscles, so our movement muscles. And there was this genesis, this start of exercise countermeasures. So one of the best therapies that we have in spaceflight to preventing muscle loss in space is by doing exercise. Going into the 80s, all the way until around 2011, we had the shuttle missions. These are part of the International Space Station as well. So it was testing some exercise countermeasures. There's some nutrition that was in there as well. And of course, there's some basic science experiments as well. And then finally, some of the most exciting research is the stuff that's been done from 2000 onwards as part of the International Space Station. So this started up with the shuttle missions, but these days this is taken over with Soyuz from the Russian Space Agency and SpaceX as well. So really exciting opportunities to be involved in space these days. And this at the bottom I've put in red is that muscle and bone loss and the cardiovascular deconditioning that we get within spaceflight are the primary biological changes that we get as part of being in space. And of course, these systems are something that sports scientists are absolute specialists in. I just thought I'd add this in. So you can see that from the start of, I guess, the space race until the mid-70s, sports science and kinesiology, as it's known in the US, wasn't even a field. So you can see that the impact that sports science has had on the sector of spaceflight is primarily been from the 80s, 90s onwards. So only about halfway through our time as a spacefaring race. So going through spaceflight and human physiology, well, spaceflight is a really extreme environment. It causes a whole host of negative adaptations to the body. Some of these changes are really, really rapid. So, for example, we get changes in the vestibular system that's involved in our balance. Astronauts often suffer from sickness for the first few days they're in spaceflight because of this, because the fluid in the inner ear is moving around and so on. Some of the other changes can take weeks to months, but these reflect very, very long periods of deconditioning on Earth. So this example that I've given here is that loss of bone and muscle during a year-long spaceflight around the equivalent of aging 40 years on Earth. So I'm 32 years old. If I went for 6 to 12 months on board the International Space Station, I could come back with the muscle and bone that's equivalent to somebody in their 70s. So these are huge, huge changes that our body goes through in a relatively short period of time. And I think the thing I find really exciting about working within the space industry is that despite spending 60 years of working on these challenges, we haven't solved these problems. We've found therapies that can help with these things, but we certainly haven't cured muscle loss, bone loss, and cardiovascular deconditioning in space. So one of the questions I get asked quite often is around, is it dangerous, being an astronaut? And it can be a very dangerous profession. So overall mortality is greater for astronauts compared to control populations. And the thing to remember is these guys and girls that go to space are incredibly fit when they go up there. They're screened for a whole host of different diseases and so on. And despite that, life expectancies are a little bit shorter. They have higher risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease. And to try and give a comparison to what we might see with a high-risk workforce on Earth, I've done this comparison against miners. So, of course, mining isn't as common as it was a few years ago, particularly in the UK, but it's a typically dangerous profession to be involved in. And the risk of an astronaut compared to that of a miner is around 10 times greater. So you've got these huge risks associated with accidents as part of the spaceflight process. And even if everything goes completely to plan, we have this data around the Apollo astronauts, and that's that they've got twice the risk of dying from cardiovascular disease as the normal population. And this is probably due to cosmic radiation. I put this diagram on to give an overview of the whole host of changes that the body goes through within spaceflight. We're not going to go into too much detail on most of these today. I'm just going to focus on the areas that are relevant to sports science. But just starting off on the left-hand side of this figure, within spaceflight, as we get our bone deconditioning, the high levels of calcium within the bloodstream can lead to kidney stones. We see a suppression of immune function. So obviously there's a lot in the news at the moment about how good our immune systems are. The immune system stops working properly in spaceflight. We know that alertness is reduced, so our capacity to respond to situations quickly is impaired. If you think of, in particular, Mars missions, there might be situations when they land on the Martian surface to be able to exit the capsule quickly, and we know that those sort of speeds are lost with spaceflight. We know there's changes in the ability to hear, so we get hearing loss. We also get visual impairments, and much of these are caused by the fluid shift that we get in spaceflight that I'm going to go on to. You get orthostatic intolerance that can result in the ability to faint. So when you come back to Earth, we get quite frequent fainting of astronauts. Get urinary tract infections, again, from proteins floating around the body as a result of the systems going through deconditioning. And then finally get this muscle and bone loss that's one of my areas of expertise. So I've just circled these areas because this is primarily what we're going to focus on today. So I think these are the three major challenges that we have with spaceflight. We have cardiovascular deconditioning at the top, we have muscle loss on the left, and bone loss on the bottom right-hand side. And certainly I believe this is one of the major obstacles that we have to traveling to Mars and bringing an astronaut crew back in a healthy condition. It's really easy to send people to Mars and back. Bringing them back in a healthy condition where they can live full lives and healthy lives, that really is the challenge. So starting off on the muscle side of this thing, so I've got this little diagram here of rocket going up to the space station and coming back in the Soyuz capsule 6 months later. The muscle mass is lost at a rapid rate in space, and we know that this loss of muscle strength is related with really poor outcomes. And I think the thing to note as well is although you get this huge amount of muscle loss within space, we know the amount of strength that you lose is disproportionately higher. So just following on from that in the next slide, typically over a 6-month mission, we would lose around 40% of our muscle mass. So this is a huge quantity of muscle. Now this will depend on the individual muscles of the body. So we know we lose most muscles in our anti-gravity muscles, so ones that help keep our body upright when we're on Earth. But it is a large amount of muscle mass, and we know that function is impaired as well. So talking a little bit more about this function. So for any of you that are watching that are either sports science students, BTEC sports science, or maybe doing A-level PA, you'll be familiar with this force velocity graph that we have here. So along the x-axis, so the horizontal one across the bottom says velocity, we have there. And on the y-axis, you have force and torque in Newton meters. And the idea of showing you this figure is that if we're looking at slow contraction, so they've got the picture of Eddie Hall doing a deadlift. So this is a very high force, slow velocity contraction. We know that you lose muscle ability in that domain. And equally, if we go all the way to the right-hand side of the force velocity curve with very high velocity contractions that are a lower amount of force, we still have a reduced ability to produce force after space flight. So basically, space is reducing this force velocity curve downwards, so we can produce less strength at any given contraction speed. So it's not something that's confined to fast or slow contractions. The muscle is universally badly affected. So why do we lose this muscle mass in space? Well, the simple answer is because of a loss of axial loading. So if we look at this picture of Tim Peake on the left-hand side, just before he was to get on his Soyuz capsule, his body is resisting the pull of gravity. So gravity is pulling him towards the ground, and his muscles are constantly resisting that. So if we look at the muscles where we lose most strength and most muscle mass, these are going to be the muscles around the calves, things like the soleus, the gastrocnemius, the muscles on the back of the neck that support the weight of our head. When we go to space, there is no weight to be supported. So typically, this is the reason why we lose loads of muscle mass, particularly within those postural or anti-gravity muscles. Moving on from the muscle side, now onto cardiovascular deconditioning. So we've got this picture here on the left-hand side of a shuttle Atlantis astronaut from a few years ago fainting at a press conference not long after getting back from their mission of around 2 to 3 weeks in space, so a relatively short duration mission. Now, some of the observations that we see in spaceflight, we see a reduced blood plasma volume, so the liquid that's carrying all that useful stuff within our body. We also see a reduced red blood cell mass. We see a reduced total hemoglobin, so that protein that's within our blood that helps us carry the oxygen, we get a reduced amount of that by about 20%. We also see cardiac dysfunction in a whole host of different ways. And these changes that we see within the cardiovascular system can result in fainting upon return to Earth and also reduced exercise tolerance. And going back to what I mentioned before about Mars missions, returning people in a healthy condition, these are one of the great challenges that we face. So why do we see some of these cardiovascular changes within spaceflight? Well, a lot of this is because of what we see with a fluid shift. So I've got this picture of Tim Peake both before spaceflight and during spaceflight a few days in. You'll notice that he's got this puffiness within his face. And the reason why this happens is because all of the fluid in the body moves up towards the head. So the heart and the vascular system is used to trying to keep things in equilibrium. But as soon as gravity is removed, you get this removal of gravitational force and everything moves towards the head. So we look at the changes in blood pressure after spaceflight. So just starting off on the left-hand side, we've got our pre-flight or 1G condition. So this is giving examples of what typical blood pressures are within the body. So starting off at the head, your blood pressure is around 70 millimeters of mercury. Around the heart level, it'd be around 100 millimeters of mercury. And in the feet is about 200 millimeters of mercury. Now, when we go into a spaceflight environment, a 0G environment, so gravitational forces are removed, we see a loss of pressure around the legs, because there isn't that gravitational force pulling the blood downwards. So you see around 100 millimeters of mercury. The body's able to maintain almost an equilibrium around the heart, so it stays around 100. We see this increase in blood pressure at the level of the head. So you often see this puffy face and what we call the bird or chicken legs that we see at the bottom during the first few days, even a couple of weeks of space flight. Now, one of the problems that we have is the body adapts to this spaceflight environment. And as I'd had on the previous slide, one of the ways that our body adapts is by down-regulating our cardiac function and the amount of blood that we have in our body. So what happens is when we come back after flight to a 1G environment, we see we've got this reduced pressure in the feet compared to what we had pre-flight. We've got a reduced blood pressure at the heart of 60 millimeters of mercury, and we've got a reduced pressure at the head of 30 millimeters of mercury. And the problem with this is it's not conducive to standing upright. And this is one of the reasons why we often see fainting when astronauts come back. And it's certainly one of the reasons why in the Russian program, they keep people in their flight suits, in their seats, and they're carried to back to the space station to do some rehabilitation before they get them up and walking around and so on. If you look at some of the changes that we see in flight, so I've not added some of the details around the exercise intensities that we're working here, but just looking at these graphs on the left-hand side, on the top we have stroke volume, so the amount of blood that the heart can pump. We have the heart rate in the middle, then we have the total cardiac output in the middle. And these three sets of bars that we have are increasing work intensity. So the amount they're working at doesn't really matter. Just know that that's getting slightly harder as the bars move from left to right. The white bars, we have a pre-flight, and the grey bars we have our in-flight. So starting off at the top, we have stroke volume. So this amount of blood that the heart can pump, we see that this is reduced in spaceflight, so the body's got less ability to shift blood around the body. As a way to try and compensate, in number 2, the body tries to upregulate its heart rate. So we've got less blood pump per beat. The body tries to increase its heart rate to try and offset that and maintain our blood pressure. It doesn't do this successfully. So if we look at 3, we see that cardiac output is still reduced. So we're getting a reduced blood delivery and a reduced oxygen delivery. And this is problematic, not just for exercise, but when we arrive on the Martian surface or when we arrive back on Earth and so on, because the body's adapted to this spaceflight environment. Lastly, moving on to the bone side of things. So we see loss of bone mass in space that's known as spaceflight osteopenia. Now, astronauts lose around 1.6% of their outer bone mass, known as cortical bone, and around 2.3% of their inner trabecular bone mass per month they spend in space. Now, this is, again, primarily located around weight-bearing bones, so particularly around the shins, the femur of the thigh, and the lower spine. But certainly you do see it in most bones of the body, just to different degrees. And I think the thing that's particularly problematic with the loss of bone mass is that we only see this partially recovered within a year of returning to Earth. So one of the concerns that space agencies have is the amount of bone that we'd lose on a mission to Mars, we don't know whether an astronaut could ever recover that fully upon returning to Earth. So looking at this in a little bit more detail, we've got this really nice image from AGI in Earth magazine. So start off on the left-hand side. If we're looking at the spine, we're losing between 0.8 and 0.9% of spine bone mass per month. Within the tibia, we're losing 0.9% of the outer and 0.3% of the inner bone per month. And looking at the femur, this is around 1 to 2%, depending again whether that's the inner or outer bone. So we think of a Mars mission and we think of, this is best case scenario going to be 18 months to 2 years. You're looking at huge volumes of bone loss in this sort of time. You're looking at best part of 20%. And of course, there's individual variations. So some astronauts will lose more than this. Equally, some will lose slightly less than this as well. So going to the right-hand side, why does this happen? Well, on the outer bone, we have interior surface of bone, the tissue that is absorbed, and the outer cells stop producing new bone tissue that results in thinning. If we look at the inner bone, we see this loss of the internal supportive framework. And so the body is less adapted to absorbing force. And of course, this means when astronauts either arrive on the Martian surface, or particularly when they arrive back to Earth, they're particularly liable to fractures. So bringing this all back in terms of how can sports scientists help, and why would a sports scientist work for NASA? So these three key problems that we've got are cardiovascular deconditioning, we've got muscle loss, and we've got bone loss. Now, if you remember the disciplines within sports science, we've got physiology, biomechanics, and psychology. And these three disciplines have both got really valuable inputs into any of these challenges that we have with spaceflight. But today I'm just going to focus on the physiology side of things. And sports scientists, particularly in the area of physiology, are experts in the body adapting to a stress that's put on it. Now, normally that stress might be exercise, it could be detraining, it could be in disease populations. So Sarah mentioned some of the work I do is with surgery, for example. But we're experts around the body adapting to particular things. And we're certainly experts around these particular systems. Now, the second part around sports scientists being a really valuable input for the space industry is that exercise is currently the best treatment that we have. And of course, sport and exercise scientists are the experts in exercise. So how can we prevent some of these really damaging changes that we see to the human body in spaceflight? Well, the first sort of exercise countermeasure that we have is resistance exercise. So here we've got astronaut Steve Swanson of NASA using the advanced resistance exercise device. So this is very similar to what you would see in a gym, something like a squat rack or a Smith machine. The difference is this primarily works on pneumatics, because remember, in a spaceflight environment, there is no weight. So we can't take weights up there with us. Now, this particular device, ARED as it's known, we can use for strength training. We can also use for strength assessments as well. We also have some cardiovascular training apparatus. So here we've got astronaut Nicole Scott of NASA using our TVIS machine. You'll notice that she's got bungee cords over her shoulder, and these try and replicate the pull that body weight would normally do on Earth. So they're pulling her into the treadmill so that she doesn't float away. And you'll notice that TVIS is called this treadmill with vibration isolation system. So any of you that have ever been to the gym and started pounding the treadmill in the gym, you'll notice that there's a lot of vibration associated with that. And engineers at NASA don't really like vibrations with a space station that's in an orbit around Earth. So whenever we build any of this exercise equipment, we have to have a vibration isolation system, so these vibrations aren't transferred to the space station itself that could potentially disturb its orbit. So essentially this is free floating within its individual capsule. Finally, going on to this anti-gravity suit, so this really cool invention that we've got here with astronaut Koichi Wakata of JAXA, that's the Japanese space agency, wearing the Penguin 3 anti-gravity suit in the Kibo lab. So the Penguin 3 suit, or the Penguin suit from the Russian space agency where it was initially developed, has got these little bungee cords around each of the joints of the body, particularly in the leg muscles, and this pulls the body into a ball. So the astronaut has got to resist this pull for the several hours a day that they wear this. And we found that this is a really effective way at maintaining that muscle activation through several hours a day. Now, what I would say is astronauts don't particularly like wearing this piece of kit because nobody likes their muscles to be working all the time, but it is quite an effective way at preventing some of the muscle loss that we see with space flights. So bringing this back to the relevance of sports scientists, so in Sarah's kind introduction that she gave earlier, she mentioned that I was part of the first UK-led experiment on board the space station. And this is where we sent a model organism known as C. elegans, or a microscopic worm, and we sent this to the space station to investigate the molecular mechanisms, the reasons behind why we lose muscle in space, so the genetics of it. And I think the full project is beyond the scope of this talk, but what I wanted to highlight is that this is the UK team that we've got here between Lancaster University, Exeter and Nottingham. And I wanted to highlight that myself, Dr. Tim Etheridge and Dr. Colleen Dean all came from a sport and exercise science background. So this is the first UK-led experiment on board the space station, and sports science has played a 50% role in this project. Just to wrap up, some of you may have seen this already, but of course, as part of giving this talk, I'm sure many of you are very interested in the space industry. And the European Space Agency, or ESA, has just released a call for astronauts, and this is the first time in 11 years. So it's seeking applications. The applications open on the 31st of March this year. I'm not on the shortlisting panel. I'm not currently working with ESA, but certainly if you've got any questions around what they might be looking for, I'd be happy to try and answer these questions or point you in the right direction. That's everything for me. Thank you very much. Of course, I look forward to seeing any questions that you've got now. If there's anything that you don't want to ask while this is a live session, please feel free to get in contact with me over email or on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Okay, Chris, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. It's such a wonderful insight into kind of the role of sport and exercise science and spaceflight. It's not often you get to speak to somebody who's directly involved, so this is a wonderful opportunity. And thank you everybody at home who's tuned in for your engagement and really interesting questions that have come through to us. So Chris, we have a few of them, so I'm going to pose them now. The first is from Annabelle, who says, do you know of any differences in muscle atrophy between men and women after being in space? And does it affect all of the muscle fibers equally, or is one type more affected?
It's a great question. So let me tackle the first part of that question first. So yes, we think there are sex differences in the loss of muscle mass in space. We think that women are slightly better protected at losing that muscle mass in space. What we don't fully understand is whether that's a result of them having less muscle to lose in the first place. So if you compare a typical male and female, a typical male will have a larger muscle mass to start with. And a lot of the work that we've done shows that those who have more muscle mass tend to lose more in space. So what we don't know is whether that's a between sex difference or just purely a starting out with less muscle mass. Thinking of the muscle fiber types, so within the body, for anyone who's not familiar with this, you have several different types of fibers. These are broadly classed as type 1 fibers that are our oxidative fibers, and we have type 2 fibers that are our glycolytic fibers, more simply put. In terms of what we see in spaceflight, we seem to see a greater atrophy of our type 1 fibers. And we think that the reason behind this is because, again, they're part of our anti-gravity muscles. So they're the ones that are working for several hours a day while we're walking around campuses or, even now while I'm sat on a chair, my muscles are activated, and these tend to be the type 1 fibers. Whereas the type 2 fibers, these only tend to be activated when we're standing up out of a chair or we're lifting weights. They're activated less of the time. So I think they're quite well protected by the countermeasures. The type 1 fibers less so. So in short, more atrophy of the type 1 than type 2. Does that answer it fully, Sarah?
It happens once every single time. Apologies about that. We're getting lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to keep them rolling. Number 2 is from Ellie. Have you worked with elite athletes as well? And does your experience of working within the space industry differ?
Another really great question. So yes, I have worked within elite sport as well. And I would say there are a lot of parallels. One of the things I find really exciting is there are a lot of parallels between the space industry and elite sport. What I would say is one commonality between the two is around working with a multidisciplinary team. So within the space industry, I'm working with engineers, mathematicians, trying to solve some of these problems. In an elite sport environment, I might be working with psychologists, physios, medics. So you're always part of that multidisciplinary team that is really important. I think to some extent it depends on the sport or the elite sport that you're working with, but certainly when you work with the very elite athletes and Olympians, they're very receptive to the advice that you provide, and astronauts are very similar, that they're really engaged in the process. The sort of things that we're advising can protect them they can protect their health for the rest of their life potentially. So they're very engaged in trying to take that information from you and applying it. So yes, certainly a lot of parallels between working in the space industry and working with elite sport.
That's great, thank you. Right, next question. Questions from Kieran. When you have worked at NASA, what did you do and what was the most surprising or exciting thing about working there?
That's an interesting question. So what did I do when I got there? So as part of the molecular muscle experiment, my job with Dr. Amelia Pollard was to set up the lab. So as part of the NASA base, there is the International Space Station Processing Facility. So this is essentially where all international teams go to set up their experiments, prior to going up on the rocket and so on. Now, when you arrive at that lab, that's just a completely bare lab. Everything has to be ordered in from scratch. Everything has to be grown up in terms of reagents. So my job was to go there and set up all of the lab. In terms of my involvement then from the experiment, we're putting things on the space capsule, getting them ready, and then, passing over to the SpaceX team who actually upload them. In terms of what I found most surprising, the Kennedy Space Center is absolutely huge. I think to give some sort of perspective, it's about the size of Greater Manchester. It is an absolutely massive place. And when you actually go there, you realize that it's like a nature reserve as well. So when I had my health and safety induction, I was told to check underneath my car for alligators at the end of the day after I came out of the lab and stuff. There's so many surprising, exciting parts of it, but certainly the vastness of the Space Center facilities is incredible. And seeing all the rockets and everything they've got there is part of the museum as well.
Wow, that sounds absolutely amazing and is pretty well linked to this next question, which is there a lot of opportunities to travel in this career line?
Definitely. I would say you have to travel. So regardless of whether you start off in one of the traditional powerhouses of space flight, so, if you're American or you're Russian, for example, even there, you still got to be willing to travel because the individual space facilities are located across different countries. So astronauts will train in Europe, they will train in America, they will train in Russia, the Russian launch facilities in Kazakhstan, the American launch facilities in Florida. So regardless of what badge you're flying under or what country, you have to work across many different nations. So certainly loads of opportunity for traveling. Very exciting thing to be part of if you like going out and about.
Okay, that's brilliant. Now, we have a question which may be out of the scope for this talk, but I'm going to pose it anyway. You might want to give a private reply to this one. So thank you very much for the presentation. I'm also very interested in this field, and I'm currently working on muscle atrophy and aging and in the context of microgravity. Do you know if the neuromuscular contribution to muscle atrophy and dysfunction is similar in astronauts and head-down bed rest participants?
Wow, yeah, this is a specific question. So from my understanding of the neuromuscular system, there's a lot of, so I guess to give a bit of background for anyone that's not currently working in the space industry, which I guess would be most people watching, we use head down tilt bed rest as a model for replicating microgravity or space flight. So some of those blood pressure shifts between the feet and the head, by using a 6-degree down bed rest model, we can replicate some of those things we see in space flight. And some of the neuromuscular changes that we see, yes, you would see the same as what you would see in space flight. What I would say is all the data I'm familiar with is that we see it to a lesser extent in Earth-based situations. So certainly, if we're looking just at pure muscle atrophy, you lose muscle mass doing head down tilt bed rest, but you lose it at a slower rate than you would in space flight. Some of the reason is you've still got ground reaction forces, or the bed's still pushing back up on you. Some of the other reasons are you can never replicate the radiation effects and things like that. So I think it's a good model, but I think there will be slight differences as well. And space flight, it would be to a greater extent. But I'm happy if that's not a full enough reply, I can exchange emails, more than happy to.
That's brilliant, thank you. Another question from Annabelle. What qualifications are necessary to be able to work with NASA? And that links into somebody else's question who's also asked, what do you think they're looking for? You said you'd potentially give some prompts for the new recruitment drive.
So if I can tackle those separately. So starting off on the NASA side of things, I think it depends in which domain you're working with NASA. There's the usual pub quiz question of which organization has got most PhDs in the world, and it used to be NASA. It's probably SpaceX these days, but certainly within the space industry, most people would have a PhD. That's not to say everyone has. Certainly many of the payload teams that I was working with to set up my experiment have got undergraduate degrees in science. Some of those will be sport and exercise science, some of those will be biology, biomedical sciences, and so on. So certainly degree level qualification would be required. Certainly the higher qualifications you've got, whether that's a master's, PhDs, they are helpful. In terms of the separate question on astronauts, that's a very difficult question to answer. They're a very rare group of people, astronauts, that they're so incredibly well qualified. So many of them have PhDs and higher qualifications in research. They're incredibly fit individuals. So many of you will have seen that Tim Peake conducted the London Marathon from space. So, ability to do marathon level of exercises. They've got to have incredible levels of resilience. So historically, a lot of astronauts have been recruited from the armed forces because they've got a demonstrable track record of resilience. So I think there's many qualities that they're looking for, but typically I would say ability to conduct research, because that's one of the main purposes of the International Space Station. Resilience, and a good way of demonstrating that. Physical abilities, so the ability to train every day. So the guys on the space station are doing 2-3 hours exercise every day to try and limit some of those health effects. And I think that covers most of the main points, but there's many, many things that they will be looking for. Fluency in a couple of languages, for example, is another thing that they'd look for.
Okay, fantastic. And this is quite interesting, and I'm sure we'd all love to know about this. How did you get to work with NASA?
That's a good question. Sometimes I wonder if it's just a process of good luck. So let me answer this in a roundabout way. So I was lucky that I got to work with the Russian Space Agency first, and this was part of doing a master's degree down at King's College London. So certainly if you play your cards right in terms of looking for opportunities within academia and degree programs, that can open up opportunities to work with either NASA or the Russian Space Agency. In terms of my involvement in this NASA project, my PhD supervisor was the chief investigator for the project. I had my PhD, I'd finished something known as a postdoctoral research fellow position, and I was well qualified for setting up a lab. So I was asked to applied for the job, and was involved in that team setting things up. So like I say, a lot of that was good luck, but part of it is when you work within a field of, say, muscle atrophy, you get to know the other key individuals within a field, so you know who to recommend and so on. So similar to like the bone mass stuff, I'm not a bone specialist, but if you needed me to recommend people that know a lot about bone research, I could probably roll off a couple of dozen names, just because you get to know the people within the industry. So bit of right place, right time, but certainly putting yourself out there.
Okay, that's brilliant. Right, another question. Again, tell me if this is outside the scope of this talk. We've got some very interested people. Now, research shows a loss of muscle satellite cell content during prolonged space flight. In terms of reconditioning upon returning to Earth or arrival at Mars, given the role of satellite cells in muscle regenerative capacity, do you think strategies to target satellite cell proliferation would be beneficial? For example, training under hypoxic conditions?
I think that's a brilliant question. So for anyone that's not familiar with the term satellite cells, they're the stem cells within skeletal muscles, or our movement muscles. I think targeting satellite cells directly via hypoxia, drugs are difficult in space because they're not absorbed properly, so you've got to do intramuscular things, but certainly we can find safe ways of doing that. That's a good potential avenue. I think satellite cells are very important. I think if we look at this from a separate point of view, so the person that's asked the question may be familiar with a research paper a few years ago, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, that looked in rodent studies around increasing muscle mass through doping, so giving the rodents testosterone. And what they showed is that when you lose the muscle mass after that training period, they retain the satellite cells, so that gives them a greater ability to recover that muscle mass afterwards. So in the same way with your question, if you lose the satellite cells, you lose that ability to regenerate muscle when they come back down to Earth. So certainly maintaining satellite cell number is critical. I don't think it's an easy thing to do. As I say, drugs is the easiest target. In space, it's very, very difficult and dangerous to do. So hypoxia may be one of the ways of doing that. yeah, certainly something that needs to be looked at further. It's a good question.
Brilliant, thank you. Now we have a question from Sham. Do you think there will be any crewed missions to the Moon or Mars in the next couple of generations, or let's say next 20 years?
I hope so. So some of you may be familiar with the Artemis mission. So this is the ambition of NASA to send the first woman to the moon in 2024, I think it is. So 3-4 years time. Sometimes these missions get a habit of being delayed, but I certainly expect the moon missions to happen within the next 5 years, maybe. In terms of a Mars mission, there's exciting opportunities in the 2030s because depending on the orbits of Mars, Earth, and so on, the distance between the planets increases and decreases. And the 2030s are a particularly good time in terms of having quite a short distance. And that means that any of these health effects are lesser than they would be if we went in other decades. So I'm hopeful that there might be opportunities to get there, particularly with things like private enterprise and SpaceX and Blue Origin and so on. So yeah, hopefully opportunities to get there in the 2030s.
Brilliant. And I'm going to pose one last question that's come in, and that is, do you think as a sport and exercise scientist it's a achievable career, and are there many jobs out there?
I think it's definitely achievable. I mean, I think similar to, you mentioned earlier on that you've had the talk of Tim Barry earlier in this around working in professional football. And I guess I would caveat this by saying, there are not thousands of jobs working, say, in muscle loss and spaceflight, but there are jobs available for people that are appropriately qualified. And so I think by putting yourself out there, doing a sports science degree, getting a good degree from a good institution, getting loads of experience, then certainly there are opportunities out there. And certainly within the space industry, I think it's an employer of around 100,000 people in the UK. So it's not something you would immediately think of as being massive in the UK, but it does employ a lot of people directly and indirectly. So there's certainly opportunities there, yes.
I'm just going to check. I'm just checking, and I don't see any more questions having come in, and you've done an absolutely brilliant job of answering all of those. So I thank you ever so much. It's been a really insightful, brilliant talk that I'm sure is going to be replayed a lot of times by lots of different people. So I'm going to say thank you ever so much for your contribution, and thank you for everybody who stayed right till the end of this webinar, and I hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks on the Wednesday the 24th of February at 4 o'clock. Different talk again. We have Dr. Theo Bamporis presenting from a biomechanical angle. So what has sport and exercise science ever done for us? Now, Theo is our lecturer in biomechanics, and he'll talk from that outlook. He's also British Association of Sport and Exercise Science representative for biomechanics and motor behaviour. He's the editorial advisor for the Sport and Exercise Scientist publication, and collaborates in the field of human movement quality of life, specifically with clinical populations, ageing populations, and also athletes. So he's currently in the Human Performance Laboratory in Lancaster as we speak, collecting data for his latest study. So I hope you can join us in 2 weeks, because it will be a really good one. So thank you for everybody who's joined us. Please register using the same link on the events page, search sport, and they'll all come up, and follow us on Facebook or Twitter for regular updates. But thank you ever so much to everybody, and I hope we will see you back in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.